The ocean is not a place for us. We like to think of it as a playground or a resource, but the truth is much colder. It is vast and dark and sits upon the earth, hiding secrets that have never seen the light of a sun. There is a specific kind of silence found at 100 feet down. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of pressure. It pushes against your ears and your chest, reminding you that you are a guest in a house that does not want you there. Tonight, we look at 6 moments when the deep decided to reveal itself. These are not ghost stories told around a campfire. They are accounts of what happens when the abyss looks back. Story 1. The Silver Giant. The Florida Keys in the early 60s felt like a different world. It was a place where the sun was closer, and the ocean was the only thing that offered a reprieve. I spent most of my weekends out there on a small wooden skiff. I was a spear fisherman. I enjoyed the hunt, but more than that, I enjoyed the isolation. The peace that comes when you are suspended in 70 feet of water with nothing but the sound of your own heart beating in your ears is better than any spa or massage parlor. That August afternoon in 1963 started like any other. The visibility was freaking exceptional. I could see the white sand on the bottom from the surface, and the reef structures looked like jagged mountains rising from a blue desert. I rolled off the side of the boat and let the bubbles clear from my mask. I began my descent, equalizing the pressure as I went. The water was warm, but as I got deeper, I felt the familiar chill of a thermocline. It was a refreshing bite against my skin. I found a ledge at about 50 feet down. It was a good spot for grouper. So I tucked myself into a small crevice and waited. In those days, we didn't have the complex gear divers have now. You relied on your senses and your breath. The reef was alive with the usual activity. Small silver fish darted in and out of the coral, and a few sea fans swayed in a gentle current. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. Then the light started to fail. It wasn't like the sudden shadow of a cloud passing overhead. It was a deliberate dimming of the world. I looked up toward the surface, expecting to see the hull of a large freighter or perhaps a storm rolling in from the horizon. Instead, I saw a wall. It was a body. It was cylindrical and massive, appearing at the very edge of my vision and stretching out into the blue. It was at least 4 feet thick. The skin was a shimmering, polished silver, marked with long, vertical stripes of a golden brown color. I watched it move past me, waiting for the head to appear or for the tail to finish the shape. But it seemed like there was no end to it. The creature moved with a terrifying, silent grace. There wasn't pulsing of a tail or movement of fins. It simply glided through the water like a train on a track. I stayed pinned to the coral, my hand gripping the cold metal of my spear gun. I didn't even think about firing it. That would have been like throwing a needle at a mountain, and I sure didn't want it to notice me. The fear I felt wasn't the kind of panic that makes you want to scream. It was a cold-blooded realization that settled in my marrow. My animal brain was telling me that I was in the presence of something ancient. It was a predator so large and so indifferent that I was not even a ghost to it. I was just a speck of dust. The silver body continued to slide past for what felt like minutes. My lungs began to burn as my air supply ran low, but I was too afraid to move. I was certain that any sudden motion would draw its attention. Finally, the texture of the skin changed, and the massive shape began to taper off into the gloom. When it was gone, the light returned to the reef, but it felt hollow. It was empty. I swam for the surface and climbed back into my boat. I sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where I had been. The water looked the same as it always did. It was blue and bright and inviting. But I knew better. I never went back to that reef. I realize now that we are only allowed to see what the ocean wants us to see. Some things are simply too large to be understood by a human mind. Story 2. The Hammering. The ocean off the coast of Massachusetts in December is a place of gray steel and biting wind. In 1927, the Atlantic was not a place for the faint of heart. I have spent a lot of time looking at the old charts of Provincetown, thinking about the sandy floor 100 feet down. It's a damn lonely place to die. On the 17th of December, the American submarine S-4 was surfacing after a routine run. They never saw the Coast Guard destroyer coming. The collision was a jagged mechanical scream that sent the submarine spiraling down to the bottom. Most of the crew were lost in the first few minutes as the cold water rushed in to claim the engine room. But in the forward torpedo room, 6 men were still breathing. I often think about those first few hours in the dark. The emergency lights would have been dim or non-existent. The air would have immediately turned thick with the smell of salt and battery acid. Those 6 men were trapped in a metal coffin with an entire ocean sitting on top of them. But they were sailors. They didn't give up. They found a heavy wrench and began to strike the inner hull of the submarine. It was a rhythmic, desperate sound that traveled through the steel and into the water. On the surface, the rescue teams arrived quickly. They lowered hydrophones into the water and they heard it. The sound of metal hitting metal. It was a language of hope. The divers went down, fighting the freezing currents and the surging tides. One diver managed to reach the hull, and he placed his ear against the cold skin of the submarine. He heard the tapping from inside. It was Morse code. The message was simple and devastating. "Is there any hope?" they asked. The diver hammered back a single word. "Yes." But the ocean is an indifferent master. A massive winter gale moved in, turning the surface into a chaotic mess of white foam and towering waves. The rescue ships were forced to pull back to keep from being smashed against the coast. For 3 days, the world watched from the shore. People gathered on the beaches, staring out at the dark water where they knew 6 men were waiting. The tapping continued. It was a constant, steady heartbeat coming from the floor of the bay. The sailors asked about their families. They asked if help was coming. They tapped until their arms were too weak to lift the wrench. By the 3rd day, the rhythm changed. The tapping was no longer a clear message. It was a slow, irregular thud. It sounded like the ticking of a clock that was finally running down. The divers tried one last time to reach them, but the storm was just too violent. They sat on their ships and listened to the hydrophones. They listened as the gaps between the sounds grew longer. They listened as the strength behind the metal vanished. Eventually, there was only the sound of the waves and the static of the deep. The S-4 was eventually raised, but it was too late for the men in the torpedo room. When I look at the photos of that rusted hull today, I don't see a machine. I see a tomb that forced us to listen to its occupants as they faded away. The ocean didn't just take their lives, it made sure we heard every last second of the struggle. Story 3, The Pipe That Breathed. Most people think of the ocean as a natural place, but for those of us who work beneath the waves, it's often a landscape of cold steel and heavy machinery. Commercial diving is not about exploring or finding treasure. It's about mechanics, physics, and the terrifying reality of pressure. There is something that every diver fears more than sharks or darkness. We call it delta P, or differential pressure. It is a simple concept with a lethal execution. It happens when 2 bodies of water with different pressures meet. Imagine a lake or an ocean trying to force itself into a smaller space. Once that flow begins, there is no force on Earth that can stop it. In the autumn of 1989, I was working a contract on a large hydroelectric dam. The water was murky and filled with an accumulation of decades-old industrial debris. I was partnered with a man named David. He was a veteran of the trade, a man who moved through the water with the calm of a pro. That only comes from years of surviving in places where humans do not belong. We were clearing a series of intake pipes that had become choked with silt and timber. The job was routine, or at least as routine as anything can be when you are 60 feet down in a liquid graveyard. David was working near the rim of a 10-inch wide pipe. We had been told the valves were sealed and the pumps were offline. But in the deep, assumptions are often the first step toward a funeral. I was about 20 feet away when I felt the change in the current. It wasn't a surge or a wave, it was a sudden, violent pull, like that of a vacuum, only massive. I turned my light toward David just in time to see the water around him turn into a whirlpool of silt. The poor bastard didn't have time to react. The pressure differential had found a leak in the seal. Within a fraction of a second, the load of the entire reservoir was trying to get into that 10-inch pipe. David wasn't pulled in head first. The force caught his left arm and his shoulder, snapping the bone like a dry twig and pinning him against the steel rim of the intake. He was effectively a human plug. The seal was so perfect that the flow of water stopped, replaced by a crushing, static weight. I swam toward him as fast as I could and grabbed his harness, but I might as well have been trying to move the dam itself. Over the radio, our supervisor was asking for a status report. Then the sound started. It was a high, thin wheeze coming from David's regulator. The pressure against his chest was so immense that his ribcage could not expand. He was being squeezed by the lake. For the next hour, I stayed with him in the dark. I watched his eyes through his faceplate. They were wide and filled with a frantic, silent realization. He couldn't speak. He could only make that small, wet sound as he fought to pull a tiny bit of air into his flattening lungs. We tried everything. We tried to rig a winch and tried to equalize the pressure from the other side of the valve. But the machinery was old and the water was too substantial. The sound on the radio began to change. The wheezing became slower and more irregular. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a wet cloth. David's grip on my arm slowly loosened. The light in his eyes started to dim, not from the darkness of the water, but from the lack of air in his brain. I had to sit there and listen to his breathing turn into a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. Then there was a long, final exhale that seemed to vibrate through the water. When the pumps were finally reversed and the pressure equalized hours later, the lake let go of him. But the man who came to the surface was not the man who went down. The deep doesn't just take your life. It uses the very laws of physics to consume you. Now, whenever I pass a pipe or a drain, I think of that high, thin sound on the radio. I think of the water and the way it waits for the smallest leak to show you exactly how much it hates you. Story 4. The Man in the Copper Suit. The wreck of the Starlight was a serrated shadow on the seabed. About 12 miles off the coast of New Jersey, the water is a thick pea soup green. It has restless currents and forgotten things. I had been diving for nearly 20 years, mostly looking for brass fittings or porcelain that had survived the plunge. It was a hobby that required a certain level of comfort in the dark. I entered the main cargo hold through a rent in the steel hull. My flashlight beam was a weak yellow finger poking at the gloom. The silt was so thick that every movement of my fins sent up clouds of gray dust, threatening to blind me in an instant. I moved slowly, my heart a steady thump against my ribs. In the far corner of the hold, tucked behind a collapsed wooden crate, I saw something that didn't fit the scenery. It was a Mark V diving helmet. These are the iconic heavy brass domes from the early 20th century. They are beautiful pieces of engineering but haven't been in common use for a very long time. This one was sitting perfectly upright on the silt, as if someone had just placed it there for a moment before stepping away. It looked out of place, a relic from a different era. I swam closer, my curiosity outweighing my caution. I really thought I had finally found the prize of a lifetime. A helmet like that is worth a fortune to collectors. As I drew within a few feet, I noticed that the brass was surprisingly clean. It was devoid of barnacles or rust. Instead, it shined with a dull golden luster in my light. I reached out to grab the handles on the side but stopped dead in my tracks as my light hit the thick glass of the faceplate. The helmet wasn't empty. Inside the glass, I saw a face. It was a man, but his features were distorted by the water. His skin was the color of a wet mushroom, pale and bloated, but he wasn't a skeleton. He looked as though he had only been down there for a few hours. His mouth was slightly open, showing normal-looking teeth. The face looked frozen in time. I felt a surge of icy cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the Atlantic. Those helmets have a complex system of hoses and valves to keep a man alive. And this one was completely disconnected. There was no airline trailing off into the dark. There wasn't a reason for a body inside that suit to look so freshly deceased. I leaned in, my mask almost touching his faceplate, trying to understand what I was seeing. Just then, his eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a dead man. They were milky white and completely focused on me. He didn't blink. He simply stared through the glass and straight into my soul. I did not think. I did not check my gauges. I simply kicked. Pure, raw survival instincts directing my every move. I frantically swam out of that hold and toward the surface, driven by a fear I had never known. I ignored the safety stops, my mind screaming, "Go, go, go!" When I reached the boat, I was shaking so hard I could barely climb the ladder. I told my partner what I had seen, but he just laughed and blamed it on the nitrogen. The next morning, the curiosity returned, sharper than the fear. We went back down together. We found the cargo hold and the collapsed crate. But the corner was empty. The silt was smooth and undisturbed. There were no marks where a heavy brass helmet had been sitting. There were no footprints. There was only the green water and the tranquility of the wreck. I still wonder if he's down there, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone else to look through the glass. Story 5. The Sound from the Sea Shelf. I remember sitting in a windowless room in the spring of 1999. I was part of a team working for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Our job was to listen to the world. To do this, we used an array of underwater microphones called hydrophones, which had been scattered across the floor of the Pacific Ocean. These sensors were originally designed to track submarines during the Cold War, but by the late 90s, they were our primary tool for listening to the heartbeat of the planet. Most of what we heard was white noise. The distant churning of ship propellers, the clicks of sperm whales, and the occasional rumble of an undersea volcano. It was a cadenced and predictable environment. Then we heard Julia. It happened on the 1st of March. I was reviewing the data from the equatorial South Array when a new waveform appeared on my monitor. It was a low-frequency sound that lasted for about 15 seconds. In the world of acoustics, 15 seconds is an eternity. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The sound began as a deep, mournful groan that slowly rose in pitch before fading back into the static of the deep. It wasn't a motorized sound. It didn't have the sharp, percussive edge of an earthquake or the metallic resonance of a sinking ship. We named the sound Julia because of its soft and melodic quality, but there was nothing gentle about the data behind it. The sound had been picked up by every hydrophone in the Eastern Pacific. These microphones were thousands of miles apart. For a sound to travel that far and remain clear, the source had to be impossibly loud. To give you some perspective, a blue whale is the loudest biological entity we know of. If a blue whale is a shout, then Julia was a roar that could be heard across an entire continent. The official explanation came down a few weeks later, when authorities told us the sound was likely an ice quake. They said a massive iceberg had run aground near the Antarctic ice shelf, and the friction of the ice against the seafloor had created the sound. It was a logical, safe, governmental explanation. But many of us in the lab were far from convinced, because when you look at the spectrogram of a piece of ice breaking, the lines are pointed and chaotic. The spectrogram for Julia was different. It had harmonic bands. It had the structure you only see in the vocalizations of living creatures. I spent many nights looking at those patterns. If Julia was a voice, then the creature it belonged to would have to be hundreds of feet long. It would be an animal so large that it could not exist in the shallow waters near the coast. It would have to live in the deep trenches where the pressure is enough to crush a human skull like an eggshell. We are talking about a predator that makes a blue whale look like a minnow. We are talking about something that has had to stay hidden in the dark for millions of years. The most unsettling part of the recording wasn't the volume, it was the intentionality. The sound didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a call. It sounded as though something was standing on the edge of the continental shelf and roaring into the void to see if anything would roar back. Since that day in 1999, no one has ever heard Julia again. But the ocean is a very big place that is very good at keeping secrets. I sometimes wonder if that creature is still down there in the silt and the cold, waiting for its next chance to speak. We like to think we have mapped our world, but in reality, we have only scratched the surface. The Trap in the Arch. The Red Sea off the coast of Egypt is a place of impossible color. The water is a deep sapphire blue that looks almost solid against the stark yellow of the Sinai Desert. It's absolutely breathtaking. In a small town called Dahab, there's a spot that divers from all over the world whisper about with a mix of reverence and fear. They call it the Blue Hole. From the surface, it looks like a perfect circle of dark water carved into the reef. It's a vertical chimney that drops straight down for several hundred feet. But the true danger is not the depth. It is a massive underwater tunnel located at about 180 feet. They call it the Arch. It's this really beautiful, light-filled passage that leads out into the open ocean. But it's also dangerous. I went there in the spring of 2004. I was a technical diver, trained for depth and the risks that come with it. The Blue Hole has a nickname among the locals. They call it the Diver's Cemetery. If you walk along the cliffs nearby, you can see the bronze plaques bolted to the rocks, each one a memorial to a diver who went into the hole and never came back out. Most of them died because they underestimated the power of the water and the treachery of their own minds. At around 100 feet, something happens to the human body. We call it nitrogen narcosis. Some people call it the martini effect or the rapture of the deep. The nitrogen in your tanks begins to act like a drug under the high pressure. It starts as a feeling of warmth and well-being. You feel invincible. You feel like you could breathe the water itself if you really wanted to. Your judgment begins to slip away, replaced by a dangerous liquid euphoria. I was descending toward the arch when the rapture began to take hold of me. The light from the surface was fading, and the water was turning a heavy, bruised purple. I looked down and saw a diver about 20 feet below me. He was wearing a black wetsuit, and he seemed to be moving with incredible ease. He looked back at me and waved a hand, beckoning me to follow him toward the tunnel. I thought he was an instructor, or perhaps a guide who had found something interesting. In my narcosis, it seemed perfectly logical to follow him. We reached the mouth of the arch. It was a massive cathedral of rock, with light from the open sea streaming in from the other side. It looked like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I checked my computer and realized I was at 190 feet. I was much deeper than I should have been. I looked back at the diver who had led me there. He was floating in the center of the tunnel, perfectly still. That was when the narcosis broke. I realized that the man was not wearing a tank. He had no regulator in his mouth. He had no bubbles rising from his gear. He was just a dark, human silhouette drifting in the current, his arms still extended as if waiting for me to take his hand. I realized I was looking at a ghost, or perhaps something worse that used the shape of a man to lure people into the dark. I turned and fought my way back up the wall of the reef. My lungs were burning and the pressure was shrieking in my ears, but I didn't look back. I spent several hours in a decompression chamber that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the man in the black suit. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? The blue hole uses the beauty of the arch and the tricks of your own blood to invite you to stay forever. I never went back to Dahab. Some places are beautiful because they are hungry, and I had no desire to be the next name on a bronze plaque. We return to the shore because we have to. We dry ourselves off and look out at the horizon, finding beauty in the blue waves. But beneath that beauty is a reality that doesn't care about our names or our lives. It's a place of shadows, ghosts, and monsters. If you found these stories as unsettling as I did, consider subscribing to my channel, More Accounts of the Unexplained. There are many more stories waiting in the dark. For now, try to stay on the surface.